Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has again promoted his controversial vision for Gaza, saying that the population could, as he says, voluntarily relocate out of the territory. Palestinians and human rights groups fear that plan could amount to forced displacement. Israel's Defense Ministry has also outlined plans for the mass displacement of Palestinians to southern Gaza.
This is Rafah, tents among rubble. The site that Israel's defense minister proposed to place a so-called humanitarian city. It would initially house 600,000 people, then over time, all of Gaza's 2 million residents. They would be searched on their way in and not allowed back out afterwards. Gaza was already one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Since the beginning of the war, Israel has pushed Gazans into less and less space. First came so-called buffer zones, occupied by the military supposedly to keep Israel safe from militant attacks. Israel took control of the Philadelphia corridor in the south, along the border with Egypt, and then occupied 2 more corridors, the Morag and Netzarim, cutting Gaza into pieces. Gazans were later told to leave the striped areas marked here, leaving only a small portion of the strip to actually live in. The so-called humanitarian city would be located between the Morag and Philadelphia corridors near the border with Egypt. Human rights advocates have pushed back, saying the plan is a step towards forcing Palestinians out of Gaza, or what the Israeli government has called voluntary migration. No country has publicly said it would be willing to take in Palestinians.
The countries in the region would be under tremendous political pressure not to accept Palestinian refugees from their own domestic populations, who would see it as surrendering to Israeli and American wishes.
But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has leverage in Washington. U.S. President Donald Trump has also spoken of rebuilding Gaza without Palestinians.
Well, relocating Palestinians to another country, packing Gazans into one humanitarian city, is that even allowed? Let's talk about that. I'm joined now by Mark Klamberg. He's a professor for international law at Stockholm University. Professor, it's good to have you with us. You heard there the Israeli Defense Minister has outlined a plan that would see Palestinians gather in what they're calling one humanitarian zone close to the Gaza Strip's border with Egypt. And once they enter, they would not be allowed to leave. Is that even legal?
No, it's not. It would either be a war crime or crime against humanity, or both. And this suggestion that it would be voluntary, I think, is not tenable. It would also amount to crime. It's, I would say, impossible to talk about that it would be voluntary under the present circumstances.
But would that be the legal loophole then to say that Palestinians are going into this humanitarian zone voluntarily?
Well, I mean, there is a case law from the Tribunal for former Yugoslavia on similar cases. So it doesn't have to be violence or physical coercion. It can also be taking advantage of a coercive environment. So defendants have been convicted for these type of crimes at the Tribunal of former Yugoslavia. And if you look at also the ICC and the Rome Statute and the supporting documents, it would also be a crime under the Rome Statute. It is possible to move a civilian population temporarily to protect them during a armed conflict, but this is something different. They want to do this on a permanent basis. And I mean, we've heard earlier during the spring that they have a policy to expel people from Gaza, and I see this as a part of that. So I think it's impossible to talk about some kind of voluntary relocation under the present circumstances.
So then we would be looking at Israel being the perpetrator here, but what about the other countries that we've heard would be willing to take in Palestinians that leave the Gaza Strip? Would those countries, would they also then be perpetrators in this crime against humanity?
No, I haven't seen any cases where countries receiving refugees have been held accountable. This would land on Israel's feet. Now, other countries have responsibilities. I mean, for example, when it comes to providing the civilian population with food, I mean, Gaza has a border both towards Israel proper and Egypt. So, I mean, both Egypt and Israel has a separate responsibility when it comes to provision of food. But when it comes to deportation, and if Israel pushes ahead with that, I mean, the countries receiving refugees couldn't be held accountable for that. However, I mean, I think the US should consider what they're doing. If they're kind of instigating or supporting that, the US could be held accountable for this.
Well, how could the U.S. be held accountable for supporting the idea if a country that is making it happen, a country that's taking in people, could not be held accountable?
Well, I mean, Trump was talking about this early January and February. Even, I mean, he was the one who suggested this, and I mean, if they also provide the funds and resources and planning to do this, I think the U.S. should be careful with how they're proceeding with this. They could be held accountable in addition to Israel if they are kind of instrumental in pushing ahead with this policy.
Well, Professor, we're talking about international law here, which is recognized by many nations, but there really is no enforcement body for this. So at the end of the day, does it really matter if international law is violated?
Well, I mean, there is an ongoing formal investigation at the ICC. So I admit there's a difficulty to get the defendants to the court, but there is an enforcement body. And also, these type of crimes could be prosecuted before domestic courts. So if any persons who are involved in this would travel to a country which has legislation on this, they could be potentially held accountable for that. And it's not only about criminal investigations, it also matters what other countries are doing. I mean, in Europe, where there's a discussion now whether they should suspend parts of the EU and Israel Association Agreement. Right. That's also an enforcement mechanism. So I think, I mean, we're talking about enforcement now, but even more important is the situation for the people in Gaza. So I think Israel should reconsider this. They have legitimate security concerns, but this is the wrong way to deal with it.
Okay. International law professor Mark Klamberg. Professor, we appreciate your time and your valuable insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Joining me now is Ruthie Blum. She's a columnist and a former advisor at the office of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Ruthie, it's good to have you on the program again. Do you think this is a serious policy vision that we're getting right now? I mean, given that Egypt and Jordan have shown no willingness to take people in, are we really talking about free choice here?
First of all, thank you for having me again as well. I'll tell you, it's an interesting question about free choice. Obviously, Hamas never let any Gazan have free choice about anything that we've seen. And the fact that other countries, other Arab countries, have not wanted any Palestinians in their borders, it's because they fear an overthrow by the Muslim Brotherhood, since even they seem to acknowledge that most Gazans who elected Hamas, after all, seem to support Hamas. Now, as the war proceeded, we saw that many people said, no, we've got to separate the innocent civilians from Hamas terrorists, and that Israel has been trying to do desperately at great risk to itself. Now, is it a good vision? Yes, it is. And what it indicates to me that there's a lot of movement going on behind the scenes, thanks to President Trump's both pressure, carrot and stick, across the Middle East. We saw his visit to Saudi Arabia, etc. We see his talks with Qatar and others. I have a feeling that he's, offering carrots and sticks here about taking in Gazans. In any case, it's a very good vision. It's a shame that others don't see it that way, since somehow Gazans are supposed to stay in Gaza so that Israel can be blamed for their plight.
Well, Ruthie, let me pick up a couple of things to unpack here with what you said. First, the statement about separating the good and the bad people in the territory. Has that been done? I mean, can you go to Gaza and say these Palestinians are not future terrorists?
Okay, well, I'll tell you, to say that it's been done, yes, by the army especially. I'll tell you, it's very, very difficult under these circumstances with a whole terror network underground and urban combat overground, with Hamas terrorists not wearing uniforms, of course, unless they're staging some kind of parade to return a few hostages, malnourished hostages, then they put on full uniform. Most of the time, they're not wearing uniforms, and it is very hard to separate those. But Israel has tried its damnedest, and how we know that is that the idea of soldiers are told to be very, very precise in their strikes on infrastructure by warning civilians to get out of harm's way, providing them corridors to leave, etc. Now, obviously, it's not perfect.
Yeah. Well, Ruthie, let's say then, let's say you've decided which Palestinians then are not terrorists, not going to try to carry out the work for Hamas. They can stay in the territory. What about if they don't want to leave of their own free will? What happens then?
Well, that's a good question. Now, first of all, I think most of them will want to leave.
Why do you think that? Why do you think most will want to leave?
Well, many have said so. I mean, obviously, they can't be that open about it when they're afraid that Hamas is going to kill them. But we've seen this on social media. We've seen videos. We've seen many Palestinians start to get disgruntled and say, just let us get out. We know that more than 100,000 have actually left. Those who were able to bribe their way through Egypt, through, I think, Egyptian border, etc. We know that many want to leave, especially since the conditions in Gaza are so horrific at the moment. Those who want to stay, that's a different question. If the idea is to turn Gaza from a terrorist enclave into a functioning area, as President Trump even envisioned it as some kind of Riviera. Look, it's on the Mediterranean Sea. It can be really beautiful. Over the decades, there's been tons of money poured into it. It could have been that by now, but it hasn't been, thanks to terrorism and Iran.
Do you think
Yes.
if it does turn into this flourishing area like this Singapore of the Mediterranean that some have said, will that area be a part of a future state of Palestine? I mean, how do you see that?
Well, I don't see it that way. I don't believe in a future state or a current state of Palestine. Okay, I think that we've seen over and over again that attempts to create a so-called Palestinian state have brought nothing but bloodshed. Having said that, there should be no reason for Palestinians or anybody else to live there. Just as President Trump said, everybody would be welcome to live there. Do you realize that every Palestinian state that's been proposed so far, the Palestinians have said, the Palestinian Authority, forget about Hamas, has said outright, no Jews will be allowed to set foot there. Probably then Christians would follow suit as not being allowed. That is not a normal state. It's not a democratic state, and it should be no state.
From the outside, some critics say that Israel's objectives in Gaza have shifted or become unclear over time. I mean, do you think that the government has a coherent end game here? I mean, if you do, could you define it for us?
Oh, yes, I think the government has been very clear about its end game. And it's true that, there are oppositionists in Israel who keep claiming it has no end game. And of course, Israel's enemies abroad claim it has no end game. But there is an end game. Prime Minister Netanyahu said all along that the goals of the war, aside from, of course, returning as hostages, let's not forget how this whole thing started, a massacre on October 7th with rapes and beheadings and murders and abductions. So the idea is to return the hostages, of course, who are all innocent Israelis who were snatched either from their beds or from a music festival. Yeah. And to make sure that Hamas never, ever poses a threat again to Israel. We've been there before. Over the last 18 years, how many times have we had to go in and come out, come out because of Hamas rockets firing at Israelis, Hamas suicide bombers? I mean, one of the reasons that Israel did disengagement in the first place in 2005 was because of the spate of suicide bombers killing Israeli children on school buses and in cafes, etc. Okay. Now, the goal of the war was to defang Hamas totally, to remove it from all of its power, military and political, and
I want to ask you before
Israel and make it better. Yes, sorry.
I want to just ask you before we run out of time, because there's one thing I want to get in before the time runs out. That has to do with Netanyahu nominating Donald Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize. Was the letter to the UN Nobel Committee by Netanyahu, was it anything more than a nice gesture?
Well, from Netanyahu's side, I think it wasn't just a nice gesture. I believe it was a nice gesture, but the reason the caveat is that the Nobel Committee, I mean, it's not likely to give Donald Trump a Nobel Peace Prize since it's very woke and it always favors the left. And so, other than in fields like science and chemistry and math, which is what it originally was created for. But we've seen who's won the Nobel Peace Prizes, and they certainly are not people like Donald Trump.
Okay. Columnist Ruthie Blum. As always, Ruthie, it's good to have you on the show and good to get your thoughts as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, let's go now to Jerusalem, where DW correspondent Felix Tamsut joins us. Felix, Netanyahu, he's been making a lot of headlines lately, nominating Donald Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize. He's again raised the idea of Gazans voluntarily leaving the Gaza Strip. Some people say that's a forced displacement plan. How much support is there in Israel for what the Prime Minister is doing?
Well, Brent, we are talking about a situation that different opinion polls by Israeli media show that large parts of the Israeli public supports the plan. At the same time, large parts of the public also believe it's not really feasible. It also needs to be said that you get a feeling from walking down the street, talking to people. The feeling is that there's much more urgency when it comes to the government's task. Reaching a hostage deal is much higher up the people's priorities here. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Netanyahu and Trump both say that Israel and the United States are working with other countries who would be willing to take in Palestinians if Palestinians had to leave Gaza. I mean, do we have any clue which countries they're talking about?
Well, different reports suggested we're talking about various Arab-speaking countries. At the same time, countries in Europe were mentioned, and even Indonesia. At the same time, there's no official confirmation, which could be due to the fact that the countries in question want to prevent protests, as some people believe that the prospect of Palestinians leaving Gaza to be highly controversial. All we have is reports at the moment, and there is no sign of that changing anytime soon.
And I have to ask you about these ceasefire negotiations between Israel and Hamas that are taking place in Qatar. Is there any breakthrough in sight?
Well, on the one hand, you have Special Envoy Steve Witkoff U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff being sent to Doha to support the negotiations, which many believe in Israel that's a good sign. At the same time, we've been hearing reports just over the past hour here in Israel that the plan suggested by Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz to move the population of Gaza into what he called a humanitarian city in the Rafah area. This proves to be an obstacle. Which wasn't the case before, and this is one of the biggest obstacles according to Israeli media, and this makes things difficult at the moment. There is no sign of any breakthrough in sight.
DW correspondent Felix Tamsut with the latest there from Jerusalem. Felix, thank you.